And for more on this, we're joined by Professor Jannie Rossouw, who is from Wits School of Business, or Wits Business School. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor Rossouw. First, let's help us, the layman, understand the figures. A 7% drop in GDP. Firstly, how do we measure GDP in terms of GDP per capita for you and I? Why these figures impact us?
Good evening, Tsepiso, and good evening to the viewers. In short, Tsepiso, GDP measures value added in the economy. In other words, how much value is added in the economy, and then GDP in the economy is expressed on the basis of GDP per capita. And unfortunately, over the past 5 years, South Africa's economy has grown at a rate less than the GDP per capita. So our GDP per capita has been on a declining trend over the past 5 years, implying that uh, on average, South Africans got poorer over the past 5 years.
And we've also seen South Africa's debt rise sharply in 2020, and obviously so did the debt projections over the next 5 years to meet spending needs. Obviously, that also rose from the pandemic. So what does it mean in terms of our expectations of how our lot can improve, given what was mentioned in the report about the industries that led to this drop in GDP?
Well, in short, South Africa's government debt has been on a rising trajectory since the global financial crisis of 2008 as percentage of GDP, and this trend has not turned around. As a result, the government is running out of capacity to borrow, and we see government finances squeezed in many areas, like, for instance, subsidies through NSFAS for students studying at universities and many other areas. So the challenge facing South Africa is to move to more rapid economic growth. The way to get more rapid economic growth is for the government to entrust the growth of the economy to the private sector and create an enabling environment for the private sector to grow the economy, thus creating jobs for unemployed people.
And I want to just understand this point. So the funding of continuity support measures to households and businesses, along with other economic recovery plans, have also been impacted. So if it's then going to be entrusted on the private sector to help increase growth, how are they going to do that, given what I've just mentioned, that the support systems are also, being eroded?
Well, to use one example, the government wants to increase investment in infrastructure in South Africa. So one way would be to allow the private sector to play a big role in such infrastructure investment in South Africa. The other example that I often use is that the government should only buy vehicles manufactured in South Africa for the government's vehicle fleet. By changing a policy in such a way, a lot of new demand would come into the domestic economy that would stimulate domestic economy through the fiscal multiplier and result in more employment in South Africa. So the government can also be smarter with its own expenditure in stimulating economic activity in South Africa.
So in maintaining fiscal conservatism, what are the major challenges? And I'm also thinking of debt to service costs here, having outpaced expenditure in things like health and basic education programs over the last financial year, and certainly for the next financial year as well.
Well, the big challenge in South Africa is that the civil service remuneration bill has grown too fast. I always measure this expenditure as a percentage of revenue, not percentage of expenditure. Civil service remuneration expenditure over the past decade has simply grown well above the growth of the economy, thus putting a larger uh, burden on the economy. And South Africa can simply not afford general remuneration adjustments for civil servants over the next 3 years. At the same time, the interest costs of debt increased very substantially over the last decade. By now, debt service costs amount to more than 20% of total government revenue. So we can also not continue to borrow in the way we borrow. And then lastly, the tax revenue of the government is under pressure. We already see people earning above 750,000 rands per year taxable income emigrating from South Africa. The number of taxpayers in that group actually declined over the past 2 fiscal years. So the government is also not in a position to increase taxes any further,
Okay,
which
thank you.
means the only way out of this is to contain expenditure on the one hand, and secondly, entrust functions to the private sector that the economy can indeed
All right,
grow.
Professor Jannie Rossouw from Wits Business School, thank you very much for your time and insights on the latest GDP figures.